So welcome to Water Scholars Book Club discussion for Blue Mind by Wallace J. Nichols. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hannah Bates, Program Coordinator for the Iowa Water Center, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. Our media agenda for today will be the first 20 minutes Q&A with Alex Braidwood, who is the NICU faculty member at the College of Design at Iowa State University, regarding his work as an artist and how he relates his work to water resources. For the rest of the time, I'll open it up for discussion with all of you who called in. Right now, you're in audience mode in WebEx while we record the first part. As Alex wraps up his initial comments, I'll switch you over to video and audio to participate in the discussion, so please be ready for that. For those who are watching a recording of this later, we will only be recording the first portion of the book talk today. So Alex Braidwood is a sound artist, designer, and educator who maintains a practice centered around play and experimentation. He has been an artist in residence in the Australian National Park, on an Iowa farm, at a Midwestern Biological Field Research Station, and most recently on Isle Royale National Park. He is a board of director for the Midwest Society of Acoustic Ecology and the Iowa chapter of AIGA. Alex is currently an associate professor of graphic design and in the human-computer interaction PhD program at Iowa State University. He is also director of the Artist in Residence program at the Iowa Lakeside Laboratory in Okoboji, Iowa. So thank you for joining us today, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Can you describe for us what your perspective is of sound as an art form, particularly within the framework of nature sounds?
Yeah, so the thing that I find interesting about sound is that it is both very experiential and it has the opportunity to carry a lot of information. And so the idea of using sound as an art form, which is, the way that I approach it, much different than music, has a lot to do with the context in which it's presented. And so the idea of finding a space where sounds can be presented in an experiential way or in a way that also carries information offers up a platform to be able to discuss issues. And so the way that it ties into nature sound for me is through this idea of using sound, using composition, using these different types of experiments that get released online, or some of them are physical, as a way to generate both awareness and appreciation for what nature sound is and has to offer. And part of why I think that's really valuable is because nature sound can be a really strong indicator of the health and wellness of an environment. And so there's a lot of different things that can become evident through that, sort of the observation or the collection or even the comparison over time, whether it be like out in a field or at a wetland and things like that. And so we have a lot of connections that we as humans draw to sound, especially as hearing beings. And so being that we live in in a very visually dominant culture, the idea of utilizing sound as an art form is something that I have gotten really intrigued by over the years.
Can you tell us how you got started in working with sound and like your history that led up to where you are now with your art?
Sure. Yeah. It started out with, like, I played music. I played in bands. I had, the ability to play instruments and read music and things like that. And as I started working and studying as a professional graphic designer, I was mostly working with interaction design and motion design. And so because I was interested in music and, sort of like electronic, which transitioned to like electronic music and synthesis and things like that, I started getting very interested in how sound could communicate within digital environments. And so I spent a lot of time doing sound design for interactive experiences and for motion graphics. And then that just sort of transitioned into taking the recording equipment with me as I traveled the world. And I've always been into being outdoors. I'm an Eagle Scout. I grew up camping. I grew up backpacking and canoeing and things like that. And so over the years, it became a way to combine, it just was these two sort of things that like slowly came together about the time I had decided to go to grad school, where I left the commercial design field because I was interested in trying to figure out if I could use forms of communication to do something more than sell cars or pizza, but instead to get people to care about things that I thought were important. And so that sort of confluence at grad school was like, well, I love being outside and I really love sound. And so I started investigating like noise pollution in cities and things like that. And it just then gradually turned into like, oh, I like being outside with microphones. Is this a thing people do? And I started digging into it and I learned more about this field, acoustic ecology, and sort of dug in there and was able to take a pretty influential workshop with a couple of people who are like at the top of the field. Martin Stewart and Bernie Krause offered a workshop out west that I was fortunate enough to attend, and that just like solidified it. That like, okay, now that I've learned that like this is a field, this is a thing that people are doing. How do I move what I'm sort of like generally interested in, which is communication and nature and sound, into a space where I can really look into it over a longer term.
Gotcha. Where are places that you typically record sound in Iowa?
Yeah, I've been, again, really fortunate to be able to record all over the state. The density of my in-state recordings are definitely up in the Great Lakes region. So up around West Okoboji. When I was like my second year after having moved to Iowa, never been here before, getting the job. Came to Iowa my second year here. Somebody turned me on to this residency up at the Iowa Lakeside Lab. I applied for it. I got it. I got up there and realized like how rich and diverse all of the different like restored prairies, the preserved prairies, the wetlands, the lake culture were up there. So the vast majority of my nature sound recordings within the state of Iowa are up in that region. So I have sites that I've been to every year around the same time of year with this very similar equipment, very similar settings, so that I can go back and like look at those, sort of look at those recordings, look at the density, look at how like times of year for different vocalizations are shifting based on like migratory patterns and things like that. But in Iowa, that's definitely one of my favorite places to record. There's also like a bunch of rivers up there because I've gotten really interested in recording the sounds of water over the last few years, which is how this like sort of a little bit more directly connects to the text of the book. But yeah, the whole Great Lakes region up there is a really rich and diverse place for different soundscapes.
Gotcha. What would you say is your favorite sound?
Thunderstorms, 1,000%. Like that, a thunderstorm, a good thunderstorm is like it's my favorite sound for a bunch of different reasons, and I've done enough sort of investigation of this just within like my journaling and stuff to know that it definitely comes from growing up in Michigan and having these like sort of epic thunderstorms rip through, and then living in Southern California for a while where there are none, and really like noticing the gap in the way that like storms happen. Well, I shouldn't say there are none. There are very few. And so then to come back here and get like the Midwest Plain States version of a thunderstorm as it comes through, it's just like it doesn't even compare. You can hear them coming from so far away, and they're really rich with sound. It's a real reminder of like the power of nature. There's a whole bunch of things about like weather that I think are super fascinating that impact a lot of the work that I do being out in the field. And so that connection to thunderstorms is just it's there, and it's been like driving me ever since I was a little kid.
Interesting. I myself am afraid of thunderstorms and get like tons of terror when I hear thunder. So that's a very funny contrast.
Yeah. Huh. Wonder why that is. Yeah.
I don't know. How would you say artists and scientists are similar?
So I'm now the director of the artist in residence program at Lakeside Lab, and when I had the opportunity to take that over, I was building out the branding and I was writing about what the residency was, and I was trying to identify like, okay, I have this opportunity. What is it that I want to do with this? It's already like an art residency embedded in a scientific environment. There's researchers there, there's professors who are leading classes with students from a range of different sciences. And so I was trying to write like, what is the focus of this residency going to be? And I ended up developing the sort of the tagline or the framing of how I present the residency. And that is with this idea that artists and scientists are both asking questions about the world. They're just doing it in different ways. And I think that that's really true in that like both artists and scientists are trying to see things from new perspectives and figure out the best mechanism or an effective mechanism to then present that back to an audience, whether that audience is the public, whether it's the funders, whether it's other scientists, whether it's other artists. There's all these real similarities about like process, how you start out with like an inkling of a hunch or an observation or a curiosity, and then you move through a process to figure out where it might be leading. You maybe have an idea where it's going to go, but you have to go through the process in order to identify where it's actually going to land and how it's actually going to come out on the other side. And just like over the years of having opportunities to work with scientists and alongside scientists, I just see a lot of really interesting relationships for observation, documentation, question asking, methodologies. Like, you know, we talk about we talk about art and design methodologies all the time. It's a little bit less maybe studied or fixed because it's a little bit, it's not been a thing for quite as long, necessarily in terms of like the rigor of the academy, but there's still a lot of similarities there, around this idea of like chasing questions and being curious and utilizing what you've done and what you know in order to try to push something forward into a new space where nobody got to before.
Mhm. Do you think there's any particular benefit to the public of hybrid work between artists and scientists?
Yeah, I think one of the real benefits is this sort of like the circular nature of the process, which is that if you think about like, or so if I think about like the risks first, like the risk of an artist working in the space is that they could be maybe ill-informed, or they could be moving on maybe bad or less rigorous information, or maybe they could be developing something that isn't sort of isn't rooted in provable outcomes or in some sort of like it doesn't have the same kind of like rigor of evaluation and review. And so then the risk on the other side is the sort of opportunity or the risk of scientific knowledge being generated and being sort of shared in the scientific community, but never quite getting to a place where it's accessible to someone without specialized knowledge. And so I think if I feel like when I start to imagine that as like a cycle where things then have the opportunity to be informed by the specialized knowledge, but translated and reinterpreted and sort of offered up in a way to a different type of audience. To me, that seems like there's a lot of benefit there. Back to this idea of also seeing things from different perspectives. If you have people with different backgrounds bringing different filters to the conversation, asking different kinds of questions, making things accessible to and I, sort of when you say the public, I'm sort of assuming you mean kind of like the non-specialized sort of like general population who do things like elect officials and in some ways have to like agree upon or vote upon, sort of like policy regulations and the people who make them and things like that. And so thinking about what those relationships could be, it seems really beneficial if things can be from both perspectives, because both art and science runs the risk of going so far down that it exists only within the specialized knowledge of the people in the field. And there's plenty of art that does that same thing. It exists like for artists, or it exists for people who are in that space. I think people encounter that kind of work all the time where you see it and you're sort of wondering like, now, why did they duct tape the banana peel to a wall, and how is that art? There's these sort of like rabbit holes that do become like that is totally inaccessible to a general public, even if it has tons of money behind it, or if somebody paid a lot of money for it. Just because there was a lot of money to support something doesn't mean the end result is going to be applicable to the public. And you could say that line in the arts sort of just as easily as you could say it in the sciences. And so thinking about how those spaces could come together, I think is super intriguing. And some of that comes from my background as a communication designer. That was my professional career, was to try to attach people to messages and try to figure out and to do a lot of testing, and involved people from the social sciences and from different aspects of usability to try to figure out like, okay, how do we get a message to someone who sort of perceives messages in this way, and and what things do we have to sort of try to get them to care about. It's what in the book, it's what he refers to as that like soft approach, which I thought, which I think is like a really valuable thing to be thinking experientially in that way.
Mhm. So Blue Mind also focuses on mindfulness and being near the water. Does your work kind of incorporate this approach or this feeling when you're doing your work?
Yeah, it definitely does when I'm doing the work, because one of the aspects of sound, and it's one of, it sounds super obvious when I say it, but it took sort of thinking about it and having people say it to me for it to really set in. One of the things about working with sound is that time is an inherent requirement of sound. You have to have time in order for sound to exist. There's no such thing as a freeze frame in sound. You have images. A still image is an image for as long as you look at it. A video is made up of a series of still images. But with sound, there's no such thing as like a still frame. And so to go out, based on the fact that my work is all rooted in the idea of, well, most of my work is rooted in the idea of recording sound, that means I have to go out and set things up and then wait and listen and experience that sound oftentimes when it's happening. And so there's a lot of value in learning how to, for example, like sit really, really still up in the mountains of Australia's Alpine National Park in the peak of their summer, surrounded by mosquitoes for an hour and a half while I'm trying to hold perfectly still so that my recording isn't just a bunch of like slapping and swearing sounds. Like all of these, there's all these like funny little lessons that I had to learn about like being not like being quiet and being still. But then the other side of that is being present. And this idea of mindfulness really resonates with the idea of active listening and deep listening, and giving some level of time to that. And so I think there's a lot of really valuable overlap in the way that I go about making the work. And so then the other side of that is my hope is that my work can inspire that in the listeners or in the audience or in anybody who's either like even maybe reading about the work or participating in the work. So I try to do a lot of participatory stuff where I will do like walking tours. I've done a few different walking tours with these like headphones that I've created that modify the sound as you're listening to them, or sort of in whatever space you're in. It intentionally modifies your relationship to your local environment in a subtle way, just as a way to bring your attention to it, to help you focus on your ears and what you're hearing. And so that is a huge part of what I try to get out there, is this idea of like being able to more actively listen, but also being appreciative of sort of where you are and wherever you are, being able to sort of actively listen in that space.
Gotcha. When you do your work and pick a place for your sound recordings, do you feel particularly drawn to the water, kind of like what the author describes in the book, that people feel really pulled to the water for the benefits that it can have?
Absolutely. And that was part of why the book was so intriguing to me initially, was because I had never thought of it in that way. Growing up in Michigan, like our last book about the Great Lakes was just like reading about my summers. Like we were always trying to get to the lakes and things like that. And so in Michigan has a lot of water. We have a lot of lakes. We have a lot of rivers, not just the Great Lakes, but there's a lot of inland lakes as well. And so I spent a lot of time like on and near rivers and things like that, and then living out west and like getting to the ocean as frequently as possible, spending some time up in Okoboji for Lakeside Lab, and enjoying like being on the rivers here. It wasn't until I heard about this book and sort of saw it virally spread that I was able to sort of wrap some reasoning around where that came from. And so as a result, I was also starting to spend a little bit more time recording water and enjoying it, not just focusing on the so in sound studies, there's a high level categorization of sounds where you refer to sounds as being biophony, geophony, or anthrophony. And there's a loose reference to it sort of towards the end of the book. But basically, like the anthrophony is human centered sounds. Uh, Biophony is anything that's like biological, anything that's like a living biological creature that makes a sound. And then geophony is sounds that are coming from essentially inanimate objects. So like wind and leaves and water. And so I never really gave much attention to that other than knowing that I enjoyed it, to think like, oh yes, there's the ocean waves or there's a river. But it wasn't until I really started playing around with microphones, recording it. I have what are called hydrophones. They're underwater microphones, which I've done a couple of different projects with, um, where it starts to get really interesting, where you can hear all these differences in water level and flow volume and things like that in a river, or you can start to hear the difference in weather, the impact that different sort of features are having on lakes with like subtle lapping waves or large waves and windy conditions and things like that. So that connection to water definitely grew through the act of like recording it, listening to it in detail through really high quality microphones. And then the point for me that got really interesting was I did do a project that was part of an exhibition that was called River Vacancy, and it was here in Ames, and it was on the Skunk River, and it was between two different an inlet and an outlet, and there were 9 different artists set up along the water, and the way you experienced the art show was you floated down through it, and I did mine with uh, safely as I could, dangled a bunch of electronics over the river and had a microphone in the river performing the river in real time for people as they came by. And it was just another way of like engaging with the water. So that act of like listening in the water and the recording definitely was framed by some of the things that I learned from this book about why we are so connected to water, and why we want to be near it so much.
Mhm. So final question, what can people do to become more aware of sounds in their surroundings, and what sort of benefits can they gain by being more mindful of sounds?
A couple, so okay, so what can they do and then what can they benefit? So a couple of things that you can do is, there's a couple of just like simple exercises that I like to do, and there it's the kind of thing where it's like anything else. When you start out, you just do it a little bit at a time, and then you can grow and you can expand it. But one of my favorite things to do to practice listening is to focus on my ears and try to identify the smallest sound that I can hear in a space. So like I've told the story a few times, but like this is my favorite thing to do if I'm sitting in kind of if I'm sitting in a room and waiting for like a meeting to start. My absolute favorite thing to do is to just sort of like take a deep breath and try to pick out what is the smallest sound I can hear, and that really like activates my ears. So that's one of my favorite ones. And there's other variations of this that you could do, where you can then start to think like, well, what's the farthest away sound I can hear? Can I hear anything above me? Can I hear anything below me? And if you just start internalizing these questions and sort of asking like, what do I hear to my left? Because again, if our faculties are sort of functioning, if we're hearing beings, if we have our ability to hear, our ears work pretty similarly. We hear sounds all the way around us, 360 degrees. We hear way more than we see. And we have we have way less control over our hearing than we do our eyes. We can close our eyes, we can look away from something. We don't have the ability to do either one of those things with our ears. So from a soundscape protection standpoint, that part's really important. So thinking about actively engaging with what you're hearing and trying to listen accurately. It's also beneficial to think about the difference between listening and hearing. So, um, the way that it often gets sort of talked about in acoustic ecology, or in sort of the circle that I run in, even as a sound artist, is that like hearing is what the mechanical process of your ear does, but listening is once your mind gets involved and you start actively engaging with what's coming in. So the hearing we can't control, but the listening we can. We can become better listeners, and that's true. Music training has taught us that for a really long time. So then I think the benefit of it comes to awareness. If you're able to do those kind of things, they can have all kinds of different like calming effects. They can have a sort of like recentering, a presence, and the sort of mindfulness study stuff coming out of places like Yale and even USC's like starting to get really strong in the way that they're scientifically like monitoring what's happening inside of people's minds as sort of as they kind of refocus these attentions. So yeah, so those are my couple like favorite things to do as a way to just practice trying to just listen a little bit better to our space.